The following series is meant as pure fan fiction, and in no way does it share the views of anyone else or those involved in this story. We now continue with If Kurt Cobain Lived, 1994, Part 2. If you have not watched Part 1, please go back and watch that first, as it is a recap of everything leading up to this point. April 11th to 12th, 1994. Kurt has yet to talk to Courtney Love. He hasn't been to the Lake Washington house. He hasn't spoken to the media. No word on his death rumors have been confirmed or denied. All anyone knows is that Kurt hasn't returned anyone's calls and no one knows where he is. But at this moment, Kurt is with Tom Grant. Tom Grant says he has to fly back to LA and offers to pay for Kurt's flight, quote unquote, as long as he pays me back. Cobain had two choices: confront his wife and his financial problems with Nirvana and the record company, or go back to the rehab he escaped from the week before. Cobain ultimately chooses rehab. Going to rehab was part of the agreement in the intervention for Kurt, which included some members of Nirvana's management. Kurt knew the only way out of the tour that he skipped out on was to go to rehab, so this was the only logical choice he has left, unless he wants to die, which he does not. At this point, Tom convinces Kurt to proceed with the divorce against his wife and ensures Cobain that his daughter will be fine. Grant also explains to Cobain that his work for Courtney Love has ended. He finished the job he was hired to do, which is find her husband, and he did just that. He was about to fly to LA with him. Grant would now have to call Courtney and tell her he found Kurt and that he's back at the rehab facility after a flight to Seattle. Kurt then decides that after he calls Courtney, Kurt wants to hire Tom on the side to keep an eye on Courtney while she's in LA. Grant will agree to this. Kurt now checks into the Exodus rehab facility again after he escaped about 10 days prior. April 13th to 14th, 1994. After hearing from Tom Grant about Kurt being found and dropped back off at rehab, Courtney took to the media. She would tell the news that Kurt was alive and well and in rehab, and that all the rumors of Kurt's death were bogus and fan fiction. She would later say Kurt was never missing. He was just off doing his own thing. It's what he does. He always comes home, she would say. Courtney begins to contradict everything she said about the situation in prior interviews. No comment from Kurt Cobain or members of Nirvana or Tom Grant at this moment. The next few months of 1994 would consist of legal battles between the band and management, as well as Cobain and Courtney Love. In late April 1994, Cobain, while in rehab, was asked to comment on the past couple months. "I wasn't missing. I knew where I was," Cobain would say about the public affairs Love would spew to the media in the beginning of April. When asked about rehab, Cobain would say, "I have to be here." He didn't elaborate further. The interview was short, and before long, Kurt was back inside reminiscing with some of the people he knew inside the rehab facility. Cobain will get regular visits from Pat Smear, as well as Cobain's daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, who was escorted into the building by her new nanny. Michael Callie DeWitt hasn't been seen or heard from since the night he encountered Tom Grant. Tom still believes something fishy was going on that night. He concludes later that Michael Callie DeWitt was to be sent to the greenhouse after Kurt arrives to assist in the death of Kurt Cobain, which would explain why she initially tried to keep Tom away from the Lake Washington house. It was all planned out. I tried to explain that to Cobain. He seemed to have a lot on his mind already and just shrugged the theory off. He was more worried about divorce and the money he would be passing up, Tom would say in his book. After all, Cobain was alive. So even if there was a conspiracy to commit murder against Cobain, it had failed. Kurt would begin calls between him and his entertainment attorney discussing divorce and the benefits of his side of the estate. Courtney and Kurt have not spoken to each other. It is well known to both of them that neither of them want to talk to each other at the moment, and no effort has been made of this date. May 1994. As we all know, in the real timeline, Cobain is dead. His body would have been found on April 8th. Now, it is May of 1994, and Cobain is alive, but not necessarily well. In May of 1994, Dave Grohl would comment on the status of Nirvana, stating, "I don't know. I think we're on a break. I haven't heard from any of those guys. I keep in touch with Pat, but everybody does." Grohl would later go on to say that he has his own project in the works, which he says will be a follow-up to his popular cassette that has circulated the underground since 1992 titled Late Pocket Watch. No word on if that will be the name of his new project. Grohl would go on to talk about the legal issues with backing out of the tour, but said, "If Kurt is in rehab, I think we are all honestly just happy that he's alive." And also said that, with him being in rehab, that basically gives us the okay with management to take a break. No further comments from the rest of the band at this time. May of 1994 wouldn't see any public updates on Nirvana and Cobain other than the interviews done by Grohl. Cobain behind the scenes is dealing with his personal issues. No details have been provided about this time frame. June 2nd, 1994. Kurt hasn't seen his daughter in a couple weeks, and out of desperation, he calls Courtney. He calls her from rehab 6 times. She doesn't answer. Growing more concerned, he gets a hold of Tom Grant, who has been tailing Courtney through LA through the last month. Tom doesn't work for Cobain at this moment, as Courtney has embarked on a tour for her new album, Live Through This, which debuted to a mediocre reception. Tom explains to Kurt that there is nothing he can do about it while Courtney is out on tour, and that's why she has not been answering the phone, and that he is busy with other cases he is working on. Frances Bean Cobain resides at the Seattle home with the nanny who lives there, no longer Callie, who has left Seattle, and it is unknown where he went. June 3rd, 1994. Courtney calls Kurt while he's in rehab. She claimed to not know he was trying to call, and that he should have simply called her agents and not have called the house, knowing she wouldn't have been there. She wasn't nice to him over the phone, and begins to explain how, if he wants to see his daughter again, to change the agreement in the divorce that she claimed, "No, you're filing." They argued on the phone for about 40 minutes, and Kurt began to spill his guts over the phone to Courtney and talk about how depressed he was about everything. It's not known what Courtney said to him over the phone, but it seemed to calm down near the end, said some of the employees at the facility. Tom Grant believes talking to Courtney was a mistake and that Kurt shouldn't have told her all the things he told her. Courtney was against Kurt at this point. It didn't seem right. By mid-June of 1994, Kurt began receiving home-recorded demo tapes from Michael Stipe of REM while he was in rehab. Stipe would later say in an interview, "I just sent them so he had something to listen to. No intentions behind it." Chris Novoselic would comment on Nirvana saying, "Nirvana isn't dead, we're just taking a break." Nirvana management hasn't spoken on the matter. Pat Smear would say, "I see Kurt all the time. I visit him. I talk to him on the phone. We might work on something soon." When asked if it would be Nirvana, Pat Smear just shrugged it off with a, "I don't know," type gesture. Last we heard from Dave Grohl, he was working on a solo project and recently did a drum spot for Tom Petty on SNL. MTV Reports and fanzines start blaming Kurt Cobain for turning his back on his fans, but they also hope he gets well soon and just want more Nirvana music. We have now reached the summer of 1994, which we all know in our real timeline, Kurt does not make it to the summer of 1994. But now, in this timeline, Kurt is still alive. Nirvana management tried to persuade them to play Woodstock 94 in August. Kurt declined, stating, "They aren't ready to be a band right now," explaining that his condition is still serious. Dave Grohl begins recording his solo record titled Late, Foo Fighters. It is to be fully recorded by Grohl himself. In July of 1994, Courtney Love begins having internal problems within her band, mainly with her bassist Kristen Paff, who wants to leave the band after the tour is done and head back home, away from Seattle. For the last few months, starting at the beginning of 1994, Courtney believed that Kristen and Kurt were having an affair. She wanted to bust Cobain for infidelity, but had no proof. Being around Kristen made her skin crawl, and Kristen really didn't like Courtney. She was only in the band because she dates Eric Erlandson. He was the first guy she met in Seattle when she moved there, and he got her hooked on heroin. Courtney and Eric believed that Kurt and Kristen were having an affair, but no other reports of that have been proven. After a long verbal fight with Kristen in a hotel room, Courtney called the rehab center to speak to Kurt. She called 14 times before Kurt finally answered. They had a fight over the phone, and Courtney accused Kurt of having an affair with Kristen and said that she's going to burn his ass alive in a legal battle, and that he will never see Frances Bean again. After this long argument with Kurt over the phone, Courtney couldn't sleep, so she resorted to taking sleeping pills. That night, Courtney ultimately overdosed in her hotel room on the night of July 18th, 1994. She was found shortly after, still alive, by Eric Erlandson, who quickly called for medical help. Courtney was taken to a nearby hospital where she lay in a drug-induced coma. Eric Erlandson kept saying, quote unquote, "That's it, the band's done, the tour's done, we're done." An official announcement was made saying that the remainder of the tour for Live Through This has officially been put on hold while singer Love recovers. Kristen would fly back to Seattle, where she planned to pack up her things and move away, leaving the band behind. She saw Love's overdose as her chance to escape. She didn't care if Courtney was going to be okay or not. Eric would also head back to Seattle a few days later, leaving Courtney in a hospital in Tennessee, alive. But in a drug-induced coma, much like her husband just a few months prior in Rome. The news reports begin to flow of Courtney's overdose. MTV states that she isn't dead, but she is unconscious. And then the similarities of Cobain's overdose in March become the talk of the music world. Cobain, learning the news, already dreading life in rehab for months, anxious about his daughter, leaves the Exodus facility and flies back to Seattle. Cobain's credit cards have been back up, and this time he was able to afford the flight. Cobain flew back to his Seattle home where he would pick up his daughter for the first time in weeks. She had been looked after by the current nanny. Cobain would gather his things and take Frances and the nanny to yet another airport, where they would then fly to Tennessee to see Courtney in the hospital. While at the hospital, Courtney wakes from her coma 2 days later. Kurt slept there with Frances over 2 nights. Quote unquote, "It's crazy how easy it is to just leave rehab," Pat Smear would note about the situation. After Courtney awoke, Kurt and Courtney had a light conversation where she recalls, "He was very gentle, like he knew it was the last time we would talk to each other." Kurt cared about Courtney, and that showed. Kurt would then fly back to Seattle with Frances and Courtney on June 21st, leaving Courtney to recover in a Seattle medical facility for a few days while Kurt went back to his Lake Washington Boulevard home with his daughter. July 24th, back in Seattle, Kristen Paff was found dead in her bathtub. The cause of death was an apparent heroin overdose. This happens June 14th, 1994, in the real timeline. It is widely believed that Eric Erlandson was the last person to see her alive, and that she was killed because of the accusations about her and Kurt Cobain. Kurt was also supposed to have died in April, but now he is still alive. Kurt would later say that Kristen's death, quote unquote, absolutely broke my heart. August 1994. Tom Grant goes public with his accusations about Courtney Love and Michael DeWitt having conspired to kill Kurt Cobain. With the motive of millions of dollars in revenue, Tom heard the news of Cobain's rehab exit to see his wife in the hospital and suggests that after spending time with Cobain, he believes that Cobain is making a huge mistake and that he should turn back now. Tom also understands Cobain's concern for his daughter, but still believes Cobain should go through with this divorce. At this time, the rumors of divorce were simply rumors. There was no confirmation to any of it. This basically confirmed it. Chris Novoselic doesn't comment on the Cobain affairs, but does note, quote unquote, "I would have loved to play Woodstock, but from what I hear, it was just capitalism in a muddy box." Throughout the fall of 1994, Courtney recovers and cancels the rest of the Hole tour, claiming, "Our bass player is dead, and I almost died. We can't be a band right now." Eric Erlandson neglects to comment on either the tour or Kristen's death. Courtney would go on to say that her and Kurt both have a lot of healing to do, physically and mentally. Kurt has yet to return to the Exodus facility to finish his rehab, but insists that he's off drugs for good and that he doesn't need rehab anymore. Kurt has been staying at the Lake Washington home, and Courtney was released from the hospital in early August. She now lives at the Lake Washington home with Cobain and their daughter Frances Bean. Although she is being tended by a live-in medical physician, the overdose messed her up to a point where she can't take care of herself, the physician would say. Kurt was distant from the relationship, leaving his daughter in the care of the nanny at the time. He would often leave the house. Kurt would neglect to tell anyone where he was going. But we would later find out that he was meeting with Pat Smear to work on some of the stuff he was sent by Michael Stipe from REM. No word on the status of Nirvana at this point. September 1994. News outlets begin to slam Kurt and Nirvana, saying that Nirvana doesn't care about their fans. Dave Grohl is still working on his solo project and had yet to comment on the status of Nirvana. Nirvana's management company would release a statement saying, "We wish Kurt Cobain the best of health in this time he is going through. We hope he gets the help he needs, and we hope to continue working with him and the other members of the band in the near future." By late September 1994, Courtney has made a full recovery. She is mad about how Kurt dealt with the whole overdose thing, and Kurt explains to her what Tom Grant showed him months prior, saying to Courtney, "You must have thought I was dead or you wouldn't have said that shit." Another argument starts, ending with Courtney trying to take Frances away from Kurt. The nanny would intervene and take Frances away to a safer location with her parents, stating, "Is this any kind of life for a child?" Cobain and Courtney would soon both leave the Lake Washington home in different directions. The nanny would then threaten to call child services on Courtney, but it's clear that the nanny sided with Kurt. He was always so calm about everything, and she would just attack him. It was clear who was in the wrong here, she would go on to say. In October of 1994, just before Halloween, a long article in Rolling Stone was published titled, "No Bliss for Nirvana, a Year Wasted." The article would aim to slam the members of Nirvana, namely Kurt, saying that he doesn't care enough about his fans to keep going, and that none of it mattered to him, whether he lives or dies. It would touch on Nirvana's cancelled In Utero tour, not playing Lollapalooza, and not appearing at Woodstock, which many labeled at the time as a waste, stating, "Nirvana is the biggest band going. Without them at these big shows and festivals, they almost feel like a waste of time, like we have to settle for second best." The article would go in more detail about Cobain and Love's drug problems and their overdoses in the months prior, the divorce proceedings, and the lack of communication from the band members. The article will go on to say that Nirvana wasted 1994, feeling that the band was in its prime at the turn of the year, and now the band feels like something you shouldn't bother investing in. In the weeks following, Kurt has seen daughter Frances Bean, who is now staying at the nanny's parents' house. Courtney has also visited Frances at separate times. The nanny would not allow either parent to take Frances from their custody at this time, with Courtney threatening to file a lawsuit. In November of 1994, Kurt would begin jamming with Michael Stipe in person at the Lake Washington home. Pat Smear would also join in on these sessions. Kurt was still a mess. His life was in shambles. Nobody cares about his band anymore. He feels like he ruined that. He only cares about his daughter. After working on some new material for a few days, Pat suggests to Kurt that he should finish his time in rehab so they can get back to doing Nirvana to make the label happy. Without rehab, Kurt owes a lot of money for backing out of these shows they had booked. Kurt reluctantly agrees, and by December, he's back in rehab, with Courtney moving back into the Lake Washington house and changing the locks. Courtney would now start pursuing legal action against the nanny so she can have her daughter. Hull is also in financial despair after backing out of the rest of their tour. Desperate for Nirvana material to be released, Geffen releases Nirvana MTV Unplugged on CD and VHS to massive sales. Management would go on to comment, "We hope to hear more of this stripped-down version of Cobain and crew in the future." At this point, contrary to our real timeline, Kurt isn't seen as a martyr for his generation in our new timeline. His story becomes less tragic and more sad and disappointing. A lot of things happened because Kurt died in 1994, but those things just can't happen this time around. The suicide awareness of the 90s exists, but not as prominent as it was after Kurt died. He is no longer looked at as a tortured soul who could no longer live on this earth, but rather as a man at the end of his rope with nowhere to go. Long story short, Nirvana is still super influential, but they aren't considered the voice of the generation while Kurt is still alive. With him being alive, other bands are taking the spotlight and not ultimately thanking Kurt for his work. Instead, Kurt is alive and in a tough place, and everyone just wants more Nirvana music without really considering what's going through his head. Rolling Stone reaches out to Cobain for an interview to elaborate on what's been going on and to talk about the No Bliss for Nirvana article. He declines to comment at this time. The nanny and Frances are staying at a motel near the Exodus Recovery Center. Kurt pays for the hotel bills while he remains in rehab. Courtney spreads rumors to the media that Kurt has been trying to overdose while in rehab, but these rumors are untrue. She also claims Cobain and the nanny have kidnapped their daughter Frances. Kurt spends Christmas morning with his daughter in LA while in rehab. This will conclude If Kurt Cobain Lived, 1994, Part 2. We hope you enjoyed listening, and please stay tuned for If Kurt Cobain Lived, 1995. Please feel free to comment down below and tell us what you think would happen if Kurt Cobain had lived. We would love to hear what you have to think.